Good morning. I'm beginning today a series of discussions on the synthesis of philosophy, science, and God. For quite some time now, there has been a sort of infiltration, for lack of a better word, in the religious community of a whole, and I'm a practitioner of Vaishnavism, which academically people may classify as Hinduism, but it's really not. Vaishnavism comes under the umbrella of Sanatana Dharma. I'm not going into explaining the variations here. That's not the purpose of this particular presentation. But I'm a practitioner of Vaishnava Dharma, and what I'm presenting is that historically there has always been a synthesis between philosophy, science, and God. So in all the cultures of antiquity, you'll find this synthesis, and only beginning probably around the late 1800s, early 1900s, during the scientific revolution in Europe, did you find a departure from that synthesis, and you found an actual breakup between the Roman Catholic Church and the scientists, philosophers of that time. So I think I've spoken about this a little bit previously, this history. I'll go over it again briefly, that the early relationship between the church and science in Europe was very close. In fact, many of the clergy themselves were scientists. The postulate of the Big Bang Theory was a Catholic priest, right? So, and many people who weren't actually in the clergy, but they were still nourished by the church in general, and they performed art, science, music, whatever it might have been, philosophy, all in relationship and patronized by the church itself. So, in the course of time, as the church sponsored many, many things, they also sponsored those who were doing the science of observing the creation, observing the wonders of the creation. And what would happen is that in the course of time, some observations of those who were doing the study of the nature of the universe, etc., became at odds with what was the biblical canon. So now, something to mention here. One was that the Bible and many of the Abrahamic religious scriptures don't deal in detail with creation. So that's not a fault in Scripture, because the purpose of Scripture was to establish the relationship between the creation, man, and God. That was the purpose of the Scripture. So where it might have dealt ontologically in the form of a narrative, a cursory dealing with the creation and how it came about and so forth and so on, it didn't purport to go into detail about the creation. That wasn't the purpose of the writing, right? But in synthesis with the church, those who were performing science, art, philosophy, whatever it might have been, the idea was that all of the things that came within those different fields would be a testament to the glory of man's relationship with God. So if they observed the creation and the wonders of the working of the creation, then they would give glory to God based on observation of these wonderful phenomena that they found in God's creation. So that was the sort of basis of the relationship. Where some divergence came in what was observed by some of those who were practicing science, particularly astronomy at that time, and the considerations of what they observed in the universal structure and so forth according to capacity, obviously. It wasn't like, they were fully equipped to understand everything, but what they could understand according to capacity they had didn't always align with the narrative that's given in the Bible. You understand? And remember, I told that the description of creation in the Bible is an ontological narrative. So what do I mean by that? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So here it's establishing an ontology that the power of God is manifest also in sound. So therefore, this revelation, which is the Bible, is the Word of God. That Word is not different from God, and God is a supreme power. Then it says that same God spoke. So now that Word coming in, that power coming to action, has separated the heavens and the earth. And then God said, let there be light, etc., etc. So I'm not a biblical scholar or anything, not that I need to be to understand the basic conversation in Genesis. But in this way, it was an ontological explanation of everything emanating from God. That was the actual premise. You understand? And the rest of the narrative, similarly, you can find an ontological thread in the form of that narrative describing man's relationship with God. So it never purported to want to give details about the universal structure, what period of time this happened in, what that was, etc., etc. Right? So now when some divergence came among those who were doing scientific observations and so forth, quote scientific observations and so forth, then there was some incoherence between the church and those who were doing that kind of research. So now what happens is the church, being the authority, mandates, well, you have to accept only or support in any way, form, or fashion that you're doing. You have to support what is the narrative in the Bible. So obviously that incoherence didn't sit well with those who were doing the research. So they had one or two options: to stand up for their own observations and explorations and so forth, and be subject to severe punishment, if not death, by the church, or to simply keep it quiet and hold an inner animosity towards the fact they can't express it, but not say anything, like in the case of Galileo. That's a prime example. In the case of Galileo, he had some divergent understandings in his work in astronomy from what was the biblical narration, but rather than to be subject to dying at the hands of the church, he elected to just submit the idea, yes, you're right, no problem. Understand? Anyway, I'm framing all of this to show that later on, especially during the time of Martin Luther, when the church itself went under crises, it became an opportune time now for the section of the philosophers and scientists and so forth to move away from the church and secularize. So that's exactly what happened. So then you get the development of secular universities, which are sheltered by the monarchy and so forth and so on, because they consider there's a value in these scientists who are discovering many, many things which would enhance the kingdom as well as whatever discoveries they made, that would be the property of the monarchy, etc., etc. So they become the patrons of scientists. Philosophers are now at this point relegated to a back seat, because even though they do a lot of thinking, they don't do a lot of manifesting of functional material things which could be used by the monarchy. So they're appreciated almost like artists are appreciated, but they're not given the same weight necessarily as the actual physical scientists. So now, under the patronage of the monarchy and so forth, secular universities arise, and there is an obvious intrinsic rebellion against not only the church, but God also, because the idea was that the church was the housing of the entire theology which prevented them from expressing what they were realizing or understanding or exploring and seeing. The church was an obstacle to that, is what they saw. And therefore, along with the church, they rejected any theological conceptions that were coming from the church. Now, obviously, this is not among every single person involved. There were many people in the clergy who still, due to their deep investment in science, obviously would not give that up. But what they did do was they made a separation mentally of, and actually the person, I think his name is Lamartine, who was the postulator of the Big Bang Theory. He wrote in one, I guess it was a book or a letter, he wrote that he would leave God in the church whenever he would go into the scientific community. So it was almost like, a operational schizophrenia of some sort. I'll have my religious reality here and my scientific reality or my physical reality or whatever you want to call it here. So that's what began to happen. And then there were those who were outright just against God. So because there were so many contributors who were actually still involved with the church, still involved with God, they made the kind of standard, you have to leave God back at the church if you want to come into the association secularly of scientists. So now you have a breaking of that synthesis between philosophy, science, and God, right? At least in Europe. That's not all over the world. At least in Europe you have it. Now, obviously, with the developments in Europe and then later in America and so forth and so on, the stage of modern science as we know it today was set in that environment. That was then exported to various places. In other words, as there was, conquest and colonization and different things like that, they would export these ideas as well, right? So I don't want to go into a whole history thing because I think this will take too long and we'll get detracted off the main subject matter. So, but anyway, that gives you a background or framing for what modern day science is, right? Modern day science has become a establishment related to modern government, which, at that time it was a monarchy and everything, but nowadays it's modern government, and their chief patronage, in other words, the way they're patronized by the government, is again the production of things that are favorable to the government's use, whether that be military-industrial complex, big pharma, whatever it might be. Scientists are employed to research and develop and produce things in those fields, as well as all the other aspects of business and technology and so forth and so on. So this has entrenched them in a position that's really powerful, because now, they're the infrastructure of modern development. You understand? So they've been entrenched now in a position that's extremely powerful in the social fabric. So because of that, they still have the idea that anything that we don't say can't be considered science. And because we've declared a complete separation from any theological considerations, especially obviously there are a lot of scientists who are still belonging to a faith of some sort. But there's a large percentage also that are actually atheists. Some are agnostic. And really, atheists are only agnostics with an attitude, right? Because agnostics admit they don't really know. I don't know if there is a God or there's not a God. That's the foundational principle of agnosticism. Atheists say, I don't know, but not only I don't know, I don't care, and I don't believe there is. So it's an extension of not knowing into an attitude of, well, I don't believe it exists. You understand? So anyway, that's the position of the modern scientific establishment. Now, being entrenched like that, they make parameters for what's science. They say what can be source material. They say what can be introduced into the community as science. And it's not just based on scientific method, it's actually based on their approval, which then becomes very subjective. So I want to go on and I want to start to move into our subject matter a little more deeply. I gave the background. I established where we are now in secular science. So I think before we move on, however, I want to come to a point where if anybody is going to debate this, I think it's necessary to have a common idea of definitions of what we're talking about. Because as we go on, we don't want definition shifting and so forth and so on. So I want to deal right now with two things. One is definitions and sources. So first, definition. So first, if we're going to talk about God or not God, let's take a definition. So there are many definitions, but we'll take a general dictionary definition. But if you go into, obviously, Scripture, which we haven't established yet because we haven't dealt with sources, right? There are many definitions. But let's take a regular definition out of the dictionary. So, dictionary says that in most religions, I'm going to skip the names here, but in most religions, the creator and ruler of the universe and source of all moral authority, and key here, what you're going to find throughout all the definition is a supreme being, right? A supreme existence, because being means existing. So a supreme form of existence, right? So the English word God has come from a German word, what is this, right? Because we have many definitions of our own, right? But it comes from, what is this? Let me look up this word. Oh, Gudan, G-U-D-A-N. And it means to call or invoke a power. So here, another definition coming from the original context of the word God in English is the invocation of a power. So it indicates a power, right? So let's keep these two definitions in mind, two prominent ones. A supreme being or state of being and power, right? Also, original causality, origin of the universe, all these different things are wrapped into that definition. Another definition we need to get for this purpose is the definition of the word intelligent, right? Because it's going to come up as a prime statement in proving the existence of God. I'm going to in part prove by using this word intelligent. So what is intelligent? So it's described as having or showing intelligence, especially of a high degree. That's the dictionary definition. Showing or having. So, first of all, if you say showing or having, it indicates possession, because to show something or have is directly a statement of possession, right? So showing or having intelligence, especially in a high degree, all right? Last definition, two more definitions for the sake of our discussion here. One is going to be nature, right? Because many times you're going to hear in the opposition argument, right, that everything is happening in nature. So what is the definition of nature? The phenomenon of the physical world collectively, including everything in it. So I won't go through the list here, including plants, animals, landscape, everything else, right? This phenomenon of the collective manifestation of the physical world is nature, according to the definition here. Last definition, phenomenon. A fact or a situation that is observed to exist or happen, especially one whose cause or explanation is in question. Something, so listen to it carefully. A fact or situation that is observed, right, to exist or happen, especially one whose cause or explanation is in question. All right? So we set the table for our definitions, and I'll come back to them as I'm discussing particular parts of things, so we don't shift the goalpost in terms of definitions. Now, obviously, this isn't an actual debate where people can then say, well, I want to introduce other definitions, etc., etc. That can be done in the comments, right? All right, next thing is, whenever we do have a discussion, everybody has sources, right? In other words, you have to have some source that you're basing your conclusions on. So obviously, in the spiritual community, sources are going to be whatever the revelatory literature is in that system, right? Scripture, common word, scripture, sastra in Sanskrit, right? But it means whatever the revelatory literature is in that system, that's the source material in general, or you can cross religious traditions and take sources from everything. You can do that as well. But that's the essential sources for whatever is being spoken from the position of theism. Atheists also have source material. Their source material is usually based because their premise is that everything that they speak on is in the realm of science as they define it. I can't get the quotes in there, air quotes, right? And that's all going to be within the parameters they've established as those things which strictly come under empirical observation. That's one thing, and that's going to be important too, because there's going to be some discussion about how much of science is really empirical, means you've observed it, right? So That's what they classify as science, and their sources are based on a history of people who've had empirical research done, and they've stacked up their conclusions or hypotheses based on that. In other words, they make a hypothesis actually, then they go through a system and they come to a conclusion. You understand? It doesn't say that conclusion can't change, just says they've based it on this methodology. Basically a hypothesis, a experimentation on it, observation of it, replication of it. You understand? Then they come to a conclusion on it and move on, right? So anyway, their source material are people who've done this, purportedly, and they have built a foundation on those works, and they stand on those works as source material. Okay? One of the things that always comes up immediately in any debate is where the burden of proof lies on either side. Normally what happens is that those who are atheists put the onus of proof for the existence of God on the theist. They immediately walk in and they'll say, well, if there's a God, prove it. Show me. Show me where's God, which is something we're all going to do today. This is the gut punch, so to speak, to that whole idea. But the idea here becomes they're putting an artificial burden on the theist that's not mandated anywhere. In other words, if you're coming and you're in ignorance of a particular thing, you can't walk through the door making demands to prove to you what you don't know. You understand? If you know something, then you could walk through the door and say, I demand that it's proven that what I know is not true. That's a difference. If I don't know, I can't walk through the door and ask for proof of something I don't know. That's why I said all atheists are really agnostics. They don't know. They just have an attitude about it. You understand? So the reality is, if you're approaching somebody who knows something you don't know, a real etiquette would be to explain it to me. and you'd have to be genuinely in the mindset of I don't know, and that should invoke humility. Now, if you find in what is being spoken some irregularity or some incongruity, whatever it might be, you can challenge it. But you cannot demand that an onus or burden of proof is on a theist. The theist knows by their experience what it is that is God. They know by their experience what it is that's God. You understand? You are not having that experience, and you're in a position where you're not omniscient, obviously, so you can't validate everybody's experience. You can only validate your own, in fact. And in your own experience, you don't know. You've not had the experience, and you frankly don't know. So really your position is, I don't believe. You understand? I don't believe. I don't know, therefore I don't believe. Because you cannot say that there's no God and you don't know that for a fact. So you believe there is no God. Just like I believe there is a God. You understand? So both of us are following a path of belief. Right? So now the argument will be, from an atheistic point of view, first of all, that we've established that actually the burden of proof is not on us, right? Nobody has that burden. It's a discussion. So nobody has a burden of proof here. Just, axiomatically the burden is on the theist. No, there's no burden. I'm having an experience of God. That's experience you're not having. You don't know. You're making an inquiry. And in making the inquiry, you can't demand that a burden of proof is put on the person to satisfy you. Part of that comes from this is now, I'm speaking outside of the actual presentation now. For me, this is just a symptom of egoism, boasted by an artificial conception of yourself as being superior to the person you're speaking to. I'm going to address that in a minute too, because it actually comes in the particular debate tactics actually that's used by atheists. So let me deal with that right now, in fact. So one of the debate tactics that's used, I just mentioned the first one, which is that they put up something called the burden of proof. I just went through that. that that's something that's artificial. Secondly, is they try to establish supremacy by qualification. So if you are not an academician, they immediately try to attack the idea that you're not an academician, or you're not an academician in their field. Therefore, you have to accept a certain inherent supremacy. They don't put that in reverse. You have understood something about God. I don't even know who God is, so I'm going to credit you with a supreme, or not a supreme, but a more qualified position in mind. They don't do that. They only do that in one direction. If I'm going to discuss with you, we have to mention all my credentials first. I'm a PhD in physics, and I have secondary degrees in biogenics and this and that, and so, and it's etc. And then usually, if you watch any of these debates, they will reinsert that many, many times in the debate. Well, I'm a physicist. Well, I'm a trained biologist. I'm a trained clinical, this or that. So it's a prominent feature in the debate tactics to try to establish supremacy by the qualification, even when it leaves the actual discussion itself. In other words, you're discussing a particular subject, they'll leave that subject to reestablish their perceived supremacy based on qualification, right? Now, it's so interesting because even if you find two people who are both academicians, one will try to posture supremacy based on their particular field. Well, I'm a biologist, I'm a chemist, right? And you'll see them compete for supremacy on a particular topic based on their particular academic positions, right? Next thing that happens is, I talked about the burden of proof and establishing supremacy by qualification. Is there four things that you'll always find them do in the course of a debate. One is to delude people. Delude means they will speak in the parlance of their particular field. So obviously, if you have a huge audience and they're not biochemists, they're not going to understand the jargon of biochemistry. That would be like me taking a particular field that I have some understanding and realization in, and I come in and I give an entire presentation with all Sanskrit, so forth and so on, all the conceptions of Sanskrit, everything else, right? That would be ridiculous, right? But what it would do would be to delude the audience that whatever I say after that must be deep, right? It must be substantial because I've just deluded people with the entire amount of information that they can't digest. But if there's any idea of being a respected person in the debate, then the idea is whatever they said, I don't know really what it was, but it must be very deep and very real. I didn't understand it, but it must be that. So that's one thing, it's called deluding. The other thing is dismissing. If you watch any debates between theists and atheists, they'll often use things like, oh, that's just nonsense. Don't be ridiculous. That's crazy. So it's an immediate dismissal, which hasn't really satisfactorily dealt with whatever the subject matter is at that time, or the particular point that's being made at that time, but it's a dismissal. Now, if you follow that, they first postulated themselves to be in a supreme position. Secondly, they've deluded people by the jargon to try to make a convincing case for being in a supreme position. Then if they say things like, that's ridiculous, that will resonate with a crowd of people. Well, that person is obviously very knowledgeable, everything, so if they said it's ridiculous, it must be ridiculous. You understand? So that's another tactic. Second thing is to degrade the point. So several times when people have tried to establish the transcendent position of God, right? Not the empirical manifestation of God, but the transcendent manifestation of God, then because that's not something it's a subjective experience, and only as a phenomenon is it objective. In other words, because sometimes they'll give this argument, well, it's subjective. You can't prove that there's God. That's just something within you. So that's a fact. That's true. But it can be seen as objective when it's a phenomenon. right? We just had the definition of a phenomenon. So if you see throughout history, millions of years of history, crossing racial, cultural, ethnic boundaries, all kinds of other things, social status, that people have the same experience, at that point it becomes an objective phenomenon. My individual experience with God is subjective, but the fact that millions or billions actually, literally, because the majority of the world's population believes in a supreme source. So if there's, I forgot, 8, 9 billion people, I don't know how many people on the planet, but if the majority of them do it, that means this phenomenon of the experience of something supreme is in more than half the population. That's not then a subjective thing, that's an objective experience, right? Be that what it may. Sometimes you'll hear them say, well, you're saying there's a God and he's transcendent, he's spirit, so why should I believe that? I also don't believe in fairies and unicorns. Fairies and unicorns don't have anything to do with the conversation, but what it is a kind of sarcasm that's put in to degrade the nature of what's being spoken. You understand? I'm saying God is a transcendent reality that can only be realized through consciousness. Well, that's, I don't believe that. I mean, can I see this God? I mean, you're arguing with me that, you're having this experience, but I'm not having it any more than I'm having the experience of unicorns and fairies. You understand what happens? In other words, you degrade the actual point by that kind of sarcasm. So that's another tactic that's used. It's called to degrade something. The last thing they do is called to distance something. So to distance something means to take a subject matter and make it seem so not viable that it's pushed way outside the realm of what people would consider, even if it's part of common sense. You understand? They'll say something like, well, how is that possible? Right? So if there's a being who can't be seen by anyone, now the first thing they're doing is starting to distance it. Because nobody ever said that God cannot be seen. There's a process, there's a whole methodology, everything else. But they've immediately distanced that idea. So for people who are not having realization, you understand, or certainly haven't had perfected realization, they start to distance the idea that that's even possible. So these are 4 debate tactics that are used by atheists. None of them are substantial, but they're used by atheists. All right, so I've gone through the history, I've gone through definitions, I've kind of set up the framework of how atheists approach debating, so forth, so on. Now, I want to introduce something that has not, in a lot of cases, been done by theists who have debates with atheists. Normally, theists become absorbed in trying to prove the transcendent position of God. The God that's not in the objective experience. You understand? Again, remember, I told objective could be seen, and it's actually a proof of the phenomenon of God because you see it throughout history and you also see it in billions of people. So that's an objective experience. But even if they didn't accept that, for a theist to continue to try to prove God's existence on a platform that's unavailable immediately, right? Immediately. So you could say that, well, you can have this experience if you do this, this, and this, which would obviously have to happen over the course of time. But their argument will be, can you show me God right now? You understand? And of course, the theists get caught up in the argument, well, no, I mean, God, and then we get into a quandary. But, of course, if we really pay attention to Scripture as a whole, God is not only a transcendent phenomenon, but he is a manifest phenomenon. In Sanskrit language, there are 2 descriptions of God, prakat and aprakat. Prakat means manifest. Aprakat means unmanifest, or vyakta means unmanifest. Vyakta means manifest. So God has both features. So now, the question is, can I prove empirically the manifest form of God to you? So I have to have source material, because if I speak it, will say, well, it's great logic and everything, but it should be in your source material. That's the basis from what you're practicing to realize that transcendent form that I'm arguing against, you're telling me now there's an empirical form. Is that in your source material? So let's take a look at it. So this is a quote from Srimad Bhagavatam. Right, I'm only going to use two sources, Bhagavatam and Bhagavad Gita. Right, it's enough. There's unlimited information. Right, but this is enough. And for part one, which is dismantling atheism, this is enough. So in Bhagavatam it says, and I'll read the Sanskrit and then I'll explain it. Dravyam kama chakalascha swabhava jiva evacha vasudevat paro brahman nacha anyo arato sti tattvataha. So he's saying here that the five elementary ingredients of the creation, not speaking anything transcendent, he's saying the five elements of the creation itself. So earth, water, fire, air, and ether, which is empirically seen in every situation within our experience. It's not something transcendent. We see it in everything. Nothing's not made of earth, water, fire, and ether. When you get into deeper breakdowns of these things, you start to get into molecules and atoms and all these different kinds of things. But the structures are essentially earth, water, fire, air, and ether. And if you go through the entire scientific field, you'll find really that's the ultimate manifestation of everything, right? Earth, water, fire, and ether. So he says these five elementary ingredients of creation, the interactions that they have to form different phenomena, right? Tables, chairs, computers, whatever it might be, whatever interaction thereof are set up by eternal time. The intuition, so now there's two aspects to which we have empiric experience of. Two aspects, one is gross, one is subtle. So he's saying the five gross elements, earth, water, fire, and ether, their interactions, which mutate into so many different things, and time, because scientists are huge on time. Every explanation that empiric science gives about any phenomenon has to do with how it happened in time. Everything. The Big Bang Theory, the universe exploded and then began to expand in the course of time. Origins of life theory, right? There's this, primordial soup, whatever it is, right? It's struck by whatever lightning, whatever it might be. Of course, I'm just, kind of glossing this. Actually, there's a whole idea of the earth cooling and so forth and so on. And then you have the reality of the organic matter that's there. That organic matter comes into mixture, and there's reactions in the organic matter that start to create life, etc., etc. But that whole thing is being described here, the interaction of all of these things, and then he describes the subtle thing, because there's two phases, the external and what's also accepted in empiric science is the subtle, like the mind, intelligence. But one thing they don't acknowledge is consciousness. If you look in science, whether it's psychology or any other science, they call consciousness the hard problem because they have not reached beyond matter. So they understand that intellectual and mental function, they believe it comes out of the neurological activity of the brain, right? We'll get to that. But the point is they can't go beyond that point. So they call it the hard problem because they know something's going on, but they can't understand what it is because at that point you're beyond matter. And the only way to understand what's beyond matter is to approach experts in that field, and there are none, except if you go to theists, right? Now, he's saying, so both the five material elements and the intuition of nature of the individual, which means mind, intelligence, and egoism, right? All the differentiated parts and parcels, they are all rather differentiated parts and parcels of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And in truth, there is no other value in them. So there is no other, let me look at the Sanskrit word for what this, artho. Artho means a value, but artho also indicates a value that's substantive. Like you can create a value on something. Like I'm going to price the value of a particular thing at this. That's going to be its value, right? But there's also a substantive value when you come to Vedic cosmology. So the word artho here means a substantive value, a reality to something. That's the import of the word artho here. So it means there's a substantive value to the thing. It's not just a ascribed value. That's the best way to put it. So here he's saying anything. Cha anyo artosti tatvataha. Tatvataha means a reality. Everything is based in this reality. If you don't see that, then it's delusional. I'll get to that in the upcoming verses. But first of all, from the first source material we have a declaration that actually the phenomenal world that we see, the five elements, all their transmutations, everything else, the subtle phenomenon of intellect and mental function, right? All of it is being declared here in our source material as God. Not just coming from God, but God himself being present in that phenomenon. So now, if you're empirically asking me to show you God, my thing is open your eyes and look around. Because what's not God here? Now, they're not at a point to understand oneness and difference. They haven't come to a theological or philosophical position to grasp that, right? So what we're proving right now only is if there's an empirical manifestation of God. Right here in our source material, it says it is. So now the idea is either you can prove that that's not true or not. You understand? So I've given my declaration that actually the phenomenal world is itself God. Now, let's go into other proof from our source material. So I'll quote from Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says in the 10th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, obviously, Jyotisham Ravi Ashumam, and then Nakshatram Aham Sashi. I'm only quoting 2 lines from it, right? I am the sun and the moon. Do we have empiric experience of a sun and a moon? We do. So here, there's declaration in our source material that God says, I am that. Not only am I the source of it, but I am that. Now, I'm going to go into probably the most profound source material from Srimad Bhagavatam, which was meant to prove all the points I'm talking about in a synopsis. It is called Chapter Shloki. And it's the second canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, chapter 9, verses 33 through 36. So there it's mentioned, Aham evasham evagri nanyat sat asat paramam paschadaham yaret sachcha yovashishekta shushmiyam. So here, God himself is speaking. So we're going to say this is revelation coming from God. This part of God is not necessary for the atheist to accept. It's not. This is a transcendent experience. And that requires all the processes to come to transcendence, to accept and understand that. So we're not asking them to accept that God spoke it. We're going to take the content of what is spoken. Is that true or not? Right? Whoever would speak it, in other words, it should still be true. So God is saying there was existence before the creation. Right? There was existence before the creation. Because if there was nothing existing before the creation, it couldn't be created. Right? That's just logical. If there's nothing before the creation, where did it come from? If a scientist will say, and they do say this, the creation came from nothing. Then, if you say scientific methodology is first observation, let's do the first step. Show me, let me observe something in our empirical experience that comes from nothing. Show me. Right? I don't want to be mundane like show me the money, but show me. Show me anything in our empiric experience that came from nothing. Therefore, the very thing that they're accusing theists of, which is producing a God out of nothing, they're actually postulating that the manifest form of God, the material creation, had come from nothing. So here we're saying scientifically that's not possible. It's not a creation unless it had a precedent. Because then it wouldn't be created, it would just be existing. Now, I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of science because they're trying to clean up on aisle 4 now by saying, oh, well, maybe everything is just eternally existing, so forth, so on. But clearly, They have stood on the grounds thus far of a Big Bang and then an origin of life theory by Darwin, right? So now, it's saying here that aham refers to God. I was there before this creation. But don't accept the transcendent spiritual aspect of this. Just take it, something was there before the creation. Because that had to be the creative situation, right? Whatever was there before had to have generated the creation, or it couldn't be a creation, right? So he's saying, I was existing before the creation. There is nothing but myself. This is deep. There's nothing but myself during the creation. So in other words, everything we're seeing now is also God. So I don't need you to go to the transcendent spiritual experience of a God. I need you to open your eyes and look around. Every single place you look is God. Everything you're examining and discovering is God. Now, we're not getting into the depth of our theology, which gives, again, that God has energies and God is simultaneously one with and different from those energies. That's out of their spectrum at this point. We're establishing the empirical proof of God. God is, in fact, the creation. So now, we have to, if they get into a debate about that, well, no, it's just nature. Remember, we gave the definition of nature. Let me go back and look at it. Let me go back and look at the definition of nature. Let me track it down here. I'm going to take it. God, intelligence, nature. I did take the definition. The phenomenon of the physical world collectively. Right? The phenomenon of the physical world collectively. Now, to say that is or is not God, that is a discussion. But we've proven empirically that there's God because we say this creation is God. You have to give me evidence that it's not. You understand? You have to give me evidence it's not God. Because it definitely wasn't me or you. We weren't there in the beginning of the creation. And we won't be here, more than 100 years or so probably now. So we will not be here even if there's an end to the creation. So you cannot claim any kind of posture which would allow you to say, I can definitively know this creation is not God. I don't know. I wasn't there in the beginning, right? I can describe the phenomenon, right? Because in science they're saying they're describing the phenomenon. I'm going to get into that in a subsequent video when I go through the creation as it's described in Bhagavatam. If you look at the creation in Bhagavatam in the third canto, chapters 5 through 12, it's exactly what they're discovering. Except that there's a whole bunch of flubbing and so forth in the scientific community. But in general, all of the ideas of the creation are present. Third canto of Bhagavatam from chapter 5 through chapter 12, including the calculation of time from an atom. They say they discovered the atom, I believe it was in 1827. Can't remember the exact date. But Srimad Bhagavatam is a 5,000-year-old document. Not a 5,000-year-old revelation, but a 5,000-year-old document. And they were talking about the atom. Okay? So now I've proven to you, right, based on our source material, that it says God is the visible empiric creation. So you're looking at God. So now give me evidence that it's not God. So now let's go to some features about God. I think even the first verse of, last thing in there says, Yo Vashishepta Shushmiyam. After the creation, only I will exist. That's an important feature. Because whoever is the manifestor of the creation can't be annihilated with the creation, right? Or they would be subject to the laws of the creation. They wouldn't be beyond it. So here's a declaration from our source material. God is the genesis of the creation, and he exists even after the creation. What that existence is, again, is beyond the pay grade of scientists right now. Right? So we've just established our point, which is within their purview. God himself is the physical creation. Right? So we described it nature because then their argument would be, this is not God, it's nature. So now it's semantics because you're calling the phenomenon nature and we're calling the phenomenon God. Right? So how do you define nature is right here. Right? It is itself the collective universe. It never says anything else. It doesn't give any other detail. It just says it's the collective physical world. Right? So Let's go to some other definitions which are going to be important here, as I mentioned. Now, when you observe the collective physical world, do you see any signs of intelligence? So you're waiting for them to definitely say something about anything negative to this. Because if you yourself are product of the creation and you're postulating that I have so much intelligence, right, then you yourself are the proof of intelligence in the creation. You understand? So that's just not an argument they can win, right? So now they can say, well, that could be there because life is unique. The human life among all life is unique. Let's see. But even in the physical creation, do you see intelligence at all? What time did the sun come up yesterday? The ratio of time that it may shift in coming up tomorrow is usually very, very small. In fact, just to get to the bottom line, if you look at the tolerances, that means the ability for error of any single aspect of the cosmos or the human body, you'll find that the tolerances are very, very narrow. Because the tolerances are very, very narrow, whoever designed it so it could sustain itself, we cannot look at that and not attribute it to having or possessing intelligence. If you do, you'd have to explain to me how non-intelligence can manifest that order and so forth and so on. You'd have to explain it. And then what you're going to get is, it's just a phenomenon in nature. So now what you're doing is just cycling words. But you can't say that you yourself, which is a byproduct of the creation, and you have intelligence to discover the creation, there's no intelligence in what you're discovering. It's ridiculous. You have the intelligence to discover the creation. That proves intelligence exists in the creation. What you're observing is phenomenally greater than you because you're just discovering it. And you're just discovering its operation, including your own self, your own body. But you attribute that there's no intelligence in the nature? Let's go back and look at the definition again. I just want to get clear. So we looked at nature, intelligence. Having or showing intelligence. Does the operation of the cosmos show intelligence? Let's not attribute it where it is, but does it itself show intelligence? The rising of the sun, the moon, etc., the way the gravity principles work in the solar system, does it show intelligence? Now, the question then becomes, empirically, scientifically, empirically, have you ever seen intelligence that's non-personified? You take the pregnant pause there to give them a chance to go da 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 da, right? Have you ever seen intelligence without persona? Again, empirically, science, empirically, show me where you saw intelligence without persona. Oh, AI is proving that. Who designed AI? So there is no place you have seen, especially when you talk about observation, experimentation, replication, you go through the scientific model, you've never seen in the model a situation where you have intelligence without persona. Therefore, we're back to nomenclature. Because if you're calling the persona of the intelligent manifestation of God we see, nature, I'm good with that. That's your belief in God. In fact, speaking of that, the quote, primitive cultures you went back and you saw them worshiping features of nature. In some cases, people were worshiping a tree or this or that. They weren't worshiping it because they were ignorant and primitive. They were worshiping because they understood that God was manifest in nature. And this was the first manifestation which came in their purview. People weren't always, in every situation, everybody at the highest level. Just now, within our own spiritual practice and tradition, everybody's not at the same level of unfoldment. Everybody has not purely realized the transcendent form of Krishna per se. But people are in unfoldment to that. And in the process of the unfoldment, we've accepted what is in our purview as worshipable as manifestations of Krishna. You understand? I'm not going to get into detail here because this may be seen in a public forum, and that'll just be something for people to jump on. The point being, we've described now the natural world, according to our source material, is God. We've described that the natural physical world is working, showing intelligence, and we've also proven scientifically intelligence is with persona. So now everything else just becomes nomenclature and a matter of your attitude. That you don't want to believe God, that's fine. That's not forced on anybody. But I'm telling you, by default, you believe in God as nature, right? Same as the primitive people that you saw, right? You believe in God as nature, and you're doing the sadhana of uncovering your God. Because you can't even conclude it's God because you were not an observer in the beginning, and you, in this current iteration, won't be an observer in the end. So you can't even confirm your own hypothesis that it's not God. Even if you don't want to believe your nomenclature is axiomatically indicating that, because there's nothing else. That was the meaning of the verse we read earlier about artha. Artha means the intrinsic value of something. There is no way around that value, that the material world itself is God. Now, of course, in our theology, we describe it as an energy of God. It is prakriti, it's an energy of God. But they're not, again, in that pay grade. So coming into what is in their pay grade, you understand? What you are seeing is actually God. That's our source material's statement. Has your source material said anything different? Scientific source material has not declared anything different. Only the scientist has said something different, not the source material. Only the scientist. So now, there are groups of scientists who have had this epiphany. And because they've had this epiphany, really, when you look at the complexity of DNA coding, show me one phenomenon in the material world, like a computer, right, where the coding came out of nowhere. Big companies would save a lot of money if you could just get random coding coming out of nowhere and it functioned intelligently to make all the things you need to have happen. That'd be a huge money-saving thing. But you have to hire somebody and pay them an enormous amount of money to code your computers. So looking at the DNA coding in the human being, that DNA coding is so complex and so amazing, it's not been replicated. You get some scientists who say, oh yeah, we did it. You put together a synthetic form of DNA. You've not replicated actual DNA. You've made a model of it. There's a difference between when I was a young boy, I made a model battleship and going to Norfolk Navy Yard and seeing a battleship. There's a difference. So the complexity of that DNA, all of the things that they're observing in the progression of science have now led many scientists to lean into what is called intelligent design. They are getting tremendous pushback. They're getting tremendous pushback because if this reality becomes manifest, in other words, if it takes over the establishment of science, there's going to be many implications for this. Because if there's intelligent design, it means the recognition of God, essentially. And for all these years, not all, hundreds of years, that there's been the rejection of God in science, it's going to put a lot of primary or very famous scientists in a not good light. Because you were supposed to be so knowledgeable, but you never understood this. So they're fighting tooth and nail to keep the idea of intelligent designs out of schools, etc., etc. We've just read recently, India has removed Darwinism from their textbooks. Because essentially, if you go read The Origin of Species, there's so many times when he himself says this this is my theory on this thing. He wasn't an observer at the beginning of the creation, which he's not postulating. He's talking about after the cooling of the universe, when the Big Bang happened and it cooled, and then we're talking about the origins of life now. He was not a witness to that. And no matter how hard you try, you can try to replicate that scene, but there's no guarantee you can account for every variable that was at that time. I worked an entire career in law enforcement, including much of it in investigations. And if I go and I'm trying to solve a particular crime, there's what's called evidentiary weight. So if you're doing evidentiary weight, you take different things and you give a value to them. If I go to a crime scene, I'll look at the crime scene and I'll start to put together a puzzle of what possibly could have happened. I may even go back to my office, gather some forensic specialists, some other people, and put together the possibility of what could have happened. Now, all of that is still going to be circumstantial evidence, and circumstantial evidence for something has a certain weight value. I'm talking criminology here and how you do investigations, right? However, if somebody gives me a phone call and says, yeah, I saw what happened, that immediately doesn't trump everything that I put together, but it solidifies everything I put together because now I have an actual direct observer. Now, this is just a simile, right? Because you can obviously get somebody who may lie or whatever the case might be. But if that person is in fact an eyewitness and they're telling the truth, you now have verifiable things that conclude all the things you put together. So the actual ability to observe something carries a much deeper evidentiary weight than circumstantial evidence for something. So in the origins of life model, a lot of it is circumstantial, building of one theory on another theory on another theory, and we're pretty much sure, possibly, that maybe this is what happened. You understand? Now, if you get a cabal or cartel of people who decide, we're going to make this canon, we're going to make this law, that's exactly what happened. Now, just as it did with the church in the late 1800s, early 1900s, scientists coming across more discovery now discover, that's going to be kind of hard to maintain as a theory. There are too many holes in it. First of all, randomly, you cannot get the combination of chemicals randomly to produce a consistency of life as we know it. Also, you can't get a situation that's observable, right? Because then science will throw in time. Well, it was over millions of years, which means you didn't observe it, right? That one species became another species by natural selection, right? But you've never seen, in our experience, cats become dogs or any of these kind of things. So everything is built on a hypothesis. And you don't have any empirical evidence except the idea that, well, it happened over time. So scientists are pretty used to using a phrase called God of the gaps. That's when theists present the idea that, well, what you're not observing is because God did it. So then they say, mockingly, that's a God of the gaps philosophy. In other words, where there's a gap in the science, they think theists are trying to fill it with God. So a lot of the people who are doing intelligent design have started to come up with a retort to that. What you're doing is time of the gaps. So everywhere you can't prove what you're saying, well, it happened over millions of years, which none of us are going to observe. Right? So I'm going to start to wind this up, but I want to bring up one more natural phenomenon that we all have empiric evidence of that is stated in our source material as being God. Mrityu Sarva Harashchaham. In our source material, God makes another declaration, I am death. Is the death rate 100%? If not, please send me the signature of the person who got past it. So the death rate is 100% at this point or not? Therefore, empirically, we can see that in the natural phenomenon, in nature, people are dying. You understand? We're not going to get into causes, reasonings, this, and that, but we will get into the fact that definitely the death rate is 100%. Our source material is saying God says he's death. So if you can't accept God in the natural phenomenon, in the transcendent position, go ahead and accept God as the reality of death. We're not opposed to that either. But there now is an unbreakable argument for the proof of God's existence, because we'll speak on the same plane empirically about the manifestation of God. The transcendent manifestation of God is beyond your pay grade, speaking to the atheist. But in your empiric experience, this is God. Prove to me it's not God. No, it's nature. That's your nomenclature. That's your deity. We call it Krishna, some call Allah, some call Yahweh, some call Olodumare. Same phenomenon. All right, I think I'm going to wrap it up here, this first iteration. I think next we're going to be trying to deal with looking especially, more specifically in the Vedic paradigm at the creation. Because when you see those things in Srimad Bhagavatam, and remember, Srimad Bhagavatam also, like all scripture, was not particularly meant to describe the cosmos. But it just happened to be that the standard of Puranas was valued according to the degree of information they contain. So what's called the Mahapurana, like Srimad Bhagavatam is called the Mahapuran, it has to contain 10 categories. Atra saga visagascha stana posnotaya manavata ishanukata stana mukti niroda mukti asraya. These 10 categories. The initial creation, the subsequent engineered creation, which is done by Brahma in our case, right? Then the maintenance of the creation, how the creation is maintained, the impetus for the creation, the teleology, what is the creation made for? Poshan means the nourishing of the creatures in the creation. It's called poshan, right? Stana poshana, manavatar. In various periods of time, what were the activities generated in those periods of time, and what was the literal manifestations of transcendent God coming into the creation during those periods of time? They're called manavatars, right? So the way you calculate time, right? First of all, I won't do it from the atom. You could look at third canto for it. But in general, there are 4 ages. So the age of Kali Yuga is 432,000 years. So if you multiply that by 2, you get the Dwapara Yuga, right? There's a secret here about the ages being switched in certain things, because the word Dwapara means second. So really it's Satya Yuga, then Dwapara Yuga, then Treta Yuga. But during the appearance of Krishna, it reverses. But I don't want to get into theology here. Anyway, you double 432, you get Dwapara Yuga, let's say in this case. Then you go ahead and add another 432,000 years, you will get Treta Yuga. And then you add another 432,000 years, you will get Satya Yuga. When one of those ages goes around all together, it is called a Dibya Yuga, one cycle. When 71 of those cycles go around, that is called a Manavatar. There's 14 of those Manavatars in one daytime of Brahma. Brahma, in this case, not even in the cosmology or theology. Take Brahma as a representation of time. So do the math on that, right? I gave you the numbers. Do the math. Add up what one day of Brahma is. Then there's also the nighttime of Brahma. You understand? So I'm not going to get into theology, because then it would start getting into the nighttime of Brahma and the partial dissolution, all these kind of things. But that is all in Srimad Bhagavatam, right? What is a Manavatar? Then it says, Nirod. What are the concluding factors of analyzing the creation? What is the concluding factors? So Nirod means what's the concluding winding up of everything. So it has 2 meanings here. One is the winding up of the creation itself, and the winding up of the understanding of the creation. If observing all of these things, and in the Manavatars, having witnessed the incarnations of Bhagavan within the creation, and the teachings and revelations from that, then the Nirod will be realization of what is God, and therefore the next category is Mukti, which is discussion of transcendence. And the final category is the Asraya within Mukti, because people have different levels of realization, right? So Asraya means what level of transcendence did you take shelter of? Did you take shelter of simply realizing I'm not the body, which is called Atma Ananda? Did you take shelter of the spiritual, undifferentiated energy? That is called Brahman. Did you realize the source of that Brahman and take Ashraya there? In Srimad Bhagavatam, the word Ashraya here means, because the whole of Srimad Bhagavatam, well, I'm not going to get into it because it's a theological discussion. So I won't go into it, right? Or maybe I'll just give it as a tidbit for Vaishnavas. The Ashraya of Srimad Bhagavatam is love of God. And the persona of love of God is Srimati Radharani. So the Ashraya, or the category, it's called Ashraya Jati, of love of God is Radharani, and the entire Srimad Bhagavatam is to lead to the understanding of Radha Dasyam, or how to take shelter of Radha to love Krishna. You understand? That's the actual purpose. But these 10 categories are manifest in Srimad Bhagavatam. That's why it's called a Mahapuran. Okay? So I will end here, and I pray devotees will give me their blessings to go on in the future parts of this series to, one, which we hopefully begin to do here today, is dismantle two things. One is the idea that there's not a synthesis between science, philosophy, and God. Right? In any culture of antiquity you look at, you'll see that that synthesis was there. Now, a partly cultural, even racial or racist narrative that has also evolved in the establishment scientific community is we can't be seen to have come late to the party. Therefore, any culture that they look back on for anything, they title it as primitive or archaic. You understand? Yet, the structure engineering-wise of the pyramids cannot be replicated today. A simple tribe in Mali called Dogon were able to, through astronomy, discover the Sirius B star, which is invisible to the naked eye, and they obviously did not have a Hubble telescope, etc. You understand? So all of these kind of phenomenon, they try to either dismiss it, put it under the water, and keep a narrative that we're in a constant linear flow of progress, and they're at the pinnacle, they're the tip of the spear in that progressive march. When, quite frankly, civilization is not really necessarily advanced. The way we eat, sleep, defend, and mate, which are the four proclivities of human life, right, or of all life, really, right? The ways that humans do that has simply been advanced. So now you are in a nice house, you can drive a car, you can defend yourself with atom bombs instead of your hands. So it's not really that civilization necessarily has advanced. Because then we have to go into a whole other theological discussion. What is the metric by which we discuss advancement? And again, I'll be getting off into another topic, so let me end it here. All right. So I'm asking for devotees, please give me your blessings. Panchakalpatarubhyascha kripasindhuvevacha patitana pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Jai Srila Gurudev, Jai Srila Prabhupada, Jai Guru Parampara, Jai Shri Sachinandan Gaura Hari, Jai Shri Radha Krishna Yugo, Jai Jai Shri Radhe.